Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're here with our guest, Brian Muraresku, and really, really pleased to see you today. And your book is incredible. We're very impressed with the Immortality Key.
Thank you. It's so awesome to see you guys like this. Because I'm a psychedelic virgin, the artwork in the back is the closest I've come to date to that mystical core. So it's been a big part of my life. Looking at your work for all these years, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I'm grateful that you took a look at it. And Allyson had mentioned her curiosity about how you developed your passion for this subject and what ignited your initial interest.
Yeah, it's a good question. It all took place on the 57th floor of what was then called the One Chase Manhattan building, a block from Wall Street, across the street from Trump's building, actually, in downtown Manhattan. This is in 2007. I was working at a law firm, very prestigious firm called Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy, and I was a junior associate trying to pretend he knew something about corporate finance, despite never studying finance or accounting and things like that. I was a Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit major, but I took a hard left turn into law school because, frankly, I was deathly afraid of getting a job as a classicist. There isn't much work. It was either a professor or a priest or something like that. So went to law school, wound up at this law firm. But the whole time I was still studying, still reading. I couldn't quite kick my classics habit. And then in 2007, I was reading The Economist. And the whole point of reading The Economist was to learn about the international marketplace and bone up on my marketing and financial chops. And I came across this article called The God Pill. And in The God Pill, it was one of the very first write-ups of these psilocybin experiments coming out of Hopkins with Bill Richards, who I had the pleasure of talking with last night, and Roland Griffiths and Mary Casamano and the whole team there. It came out in 2006. Again, wasn't on my radar. I didn't see it until 2007. And it's a small, short little article about psilocybin. But the thing that stuck out to me was that amazing statistic. About 2/3 of the participants who went through this wound up describing it as among the most meaningful experiences of their entire lives. And it mentioned this guy, Gordon Wasson, who emerged from his first experience with psilocybin awestruck, said he was awestruck. And I knew about Gordon from this crazy book, The Road to Eleusis, that I read as an undergrad at Brown and kind of put down and didn't pick up again until that exact moment. And the way I say it, it's the exact moment this book was born, because I knew there was something there. It was circumstantial and I didn't know what to make of it, but it was like a little clue that if today's initiates were having an experience as profound as this, and Gordon Wasson said the same thing in 1955, who's to say it wasn't happening 2,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago? So that's when the mystery exploded.
So classics actually called you first, before you ever knew anything about the psychedelic experience or wanted to know anything about the psychedelic experience.
Yeah, I heard about Carl Ruck. He's a big part of the book. An incredible classicist himself, Harvard and Yale trained, who had all the makings of being a Hall of Fame classicist before he wrote this book with the guy who invented LSD, Albert Hoffman, and Gordon Wasson, the J.P. Morgan banker turned ethnomycologist, who I immediately identified with as a corporate attorney there, a block from Wall Street. It was his name is in the very first sentence of that article. And I thought, Gordon Wasson. I mean, it definitely rang a bell. And I went back to my classical studies, and I'd always been interested in this Mysteries of Eleusis. And that book was like a shot across the bow. I didn't know what to make of it. And I would ask my professors about it. And it wasn't like a taboo thing. This is the late 90s. It's just that there wasn't a lot of information. There weren't a lot of people studying the ancient use of drugs, and things have dramatically transformed over the past 20 years, making this book possible.
Well, I think that the following through of this mystery and secret of what was this special elixir that the Greeks had, and that formed the foundation of Western civilization. And I think that your search that took you back even deeper than that into history, into these the unknown areas. Now I guess we have evidence from the caves in Africa, Tassili at least, that there certainly were mushroom cults. And some of the evidence that you turned up demonstrates that ergot and some of the other known psychedelics were being used by the early civilizations. Can you point toward what you think of as the biggest origin point, and then the kind of route of diffusion of this kind of Western sacrament from your current kind of hypothesis or understanding?
Sure. So I somewhat artificially start 12, 13,000 years ago. And I say artificially because there's a much longer story here. I wasn't exaggerating when I was asking the hypothetical, could this have happened 20,000 years ago? And that number is somewhat arbitrary too. Why not 100,000? Why not in other species? I'm not going to go into too long of a tangent here, but I had one of the most fascinating conversations of my entire life about a week and a half ago with Lee Berger. He is the paleoanthropologist, National Geographic Explorer in Residence, University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He has discovered species heretofore undiscovered, like Homo naledi, which he traces back 200,000 to 300,000 years. This is an archaic hominid, which is not supposed to be there 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. Its morphology goes back a couple millions. It's that archaic. And yet here it is in what he calls a burial chamber in South Africa, in the Rising Star cave system. And we had the most mind-boggling conversation about the origins of language and the origins of religion. And there's obviously a debate like there is about everything. You get 9 lawyers in a room, you get 9 opinions. You get 9 paleoanthropologists in a room, you get 9 opinions. But he's having this really dynamic debate with his colleagues across the world about what Homo naledi means. And we had this speculative conversation about the possibility that if they had a ritual as sophisticated as a mortuary ceremony, a burial ritual, then they had to have language. The way he sees it is they had to have language to pass that ritual down from one generation to the next, right? This is 300,000 years ago. And then we were just, speculating, if they had language to pass down that, did they also have pharmacology? Which I think is a very big question. And so that's what I mean by artificially starting at 12,000 years ago. I very much intend to follow up with Lee Berger and his colleagues and look into sacred pharmacology potentially as far back as hundreds of thousands of years. I think it's a really interesting discipline. I think it's ripe for investigation. I think it is observable, testable, repeatable, falsifiable, all this great scientific method stuff. That's how I approached my book, by the way, is rooting it in things like archaeobotany and archaeochemistry, which have been around for a good while, but really becoming more available and more precise over the past 10, 20 years. So like, for example, we can artificially start talking about beer 13,000 years ago. And the reason I talk about beer is because it's not crazy to refer to this kukion, this potion that we don't know how, somehow was involved in the mysteries of Eleusis. We know that it's recorded in the hymn to Demeter. We know there are other kukions mentioned in the ancient literature, like in Homer, for example, 8th, 7th centuries BC. This stuff is really old. It has an even more bizarre connection to other sacraments in the Indo-European lineage, which would include soma in Sanskrit. And I had a fun time chanting that in front of Joe Rogan. So we can chant the Rig Veda if you want. But the ancient world was full of sacraments. And the ingredients of the kukion in particular were described in this hymn to Demeter as barley, water, and mint. If you look at it from afar, and I talked to the world's leading beer scientists, I flew to Munich, Germany just to sit with him, Martin Zarnkow. He says, yeah, it's like a simple recipe for beer. We don't know that it was fermented. We don't know that it was alcoholic. But when you have water and barley and mints, there's something there. And so I started thinking about beer and where does beer begin? And turns out it could begin 13,000 years ago. At that moment we call the agricultural revolution, when we essentially leave the caves for the cities. We go from hunting and gathering to these settled lifestyle that gave birth to everything we are today, in modern humans living in cities. And they're at a couple different places. Now, I look at Rakafet Cave in Israel. I look at Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey on the border with Syria, and we're just beginning to get these initial hits of beer. Calcium oxalate is one of these biomarkers that's a telltale sign of beer fermentation. And there's a new paper coming out soon about that. I don't know the results, but stay tuned. Sometime in October, November, we're going to hear more about Göbekli Tepe. But even, I think it was 8 years ago, 2012, there was this article about beer being brewed there, potentially, in these giant troughs that could hold 42 gallons of something. If they were brewing beer, it's one of my favorite lines in the book is that maybe the world's first temple was actually the world's first bar. And this idea that maybe we were actually drinking our crop instead of eating it. And maybe it was beer, and I'm not the first person to say this, but maybe it was beer that drew humanity into this enterprise we call civilization, which turns beer from a simple drink into a sacrament. And I know that sounds all very, very crazy, but the science is beginning to show us that beer very well could have been a catalyst for civilization itself, which for me immediately has religious overtones.
Well, it makes for an unbroken chain of alcohol somehow being interfused in the Western tradition. I think it's fascinating, just as a possible sideline here, at Göbekli Tepe, I know there isn't any, or that I've heard of, hard evidence or archaeochemical evidence for psilocybin, but and that was the kind of the kind of opening that I didn't really hear any closure on, in terms of you're finding any evidence anywhere yet on early psilocybin. But there was something about some pottery or something later on in the Dionysian, like your reference to the Louvre ceramic that had possible additives to a Dionysian wine. Mm-hmm. But those columns look a lot like mushrooms, is what I noticed.
The stones, the mushroom
Tepe.
stones, they're flat, but they are sort of mushroom shaped. What do you think?
I'll look for anything. Every drug you can throw at me is on the table, Alex and Allyson. I'll look at everything. The problem with mushrooms, like most organic material, they're water soluble. This stuff is really, it doesn't preserve very well. The specimens that we did find, and we'll talk about the mushrooms, or at least the natural fungi that we did find. Frankly, I'm astonished that they were found. It's really difficult to find this stuff, at least through the archaeobotany, archaeochemistry. There's even other technology now looking into teeth, like isotope and dental wear analysis and dental calculus analysis. It gets very wonky, but there is a woman, Karen Hardy, at the University of Barcelona, who also, this is a few years ago, she found the remains of medicinal plants in the teeth of Neanderthal, going back 50,000 years at the El Cedrón cave in Spain. And so when I'm talking about this long timeline, I want to put it in perspective. We do have evidence of medicinal plant use among Neanderthal 50,000 years ago. And in some other of her studies, she did find non-psychoactive, but mushrooms nonetheless. I think dental calculus is going to be the place that we're looking for mushrooms. They just don't preserve very well, but you never know. We did find them in that miniature chalice, which we can talk about in a bit. So the point being, when it comes to science, there's a way to prove it wrong or right. So I think all options should be on the table until the science says otherwise.
Yeah.
So what about the chalice? Are we there yet? We're still moving through history. Tell us.
We can talk about the chalice.
What's the chalice? The chalice was where you found the residue.
Right. So, but the segue is beer. And so, I went back in time and I went to Munich to talk to Martin Zarnkow, this beer scientist and archaeochemist, about his work at Göbekli Tepe. And they're finding the initial indications of brewing, which, I refer to it as the religion of brewing. If beer really did precede bread and it took us from the caves into the cities, did it survive? If he's right about Göbekli Tepe, they were brewing beer. Where is the evidence for beer brewing from then, 9th millennium BC, all the way into the time of the classical Greeks? There's a very long Neolithic period in between. You're talking 8,000 plus years in between, when frankly, we don't have a lot of hits. And I think it's okay to say that. My book just wants to present the evidence as it exists today. So if, Pat McGovern has been studying this stuff for 20 plus years at the University of Pennsylvania, he does go out and find ancient samples of beer brewing. One of the oldest, and it's just not old enough, one of the oldest is 3500 BC at Godin Tepe in Iran, which is pretty old. It's 5,000 plus years old, but there's this gap from Göbekli Tepe 9th millennium to the 4th millennium. Frankly, we don't have a lot of data for this religion of brewing. So I kind of leave it at that, just hoping that the archaeochemists and the field excavators, to the extent we're finding things in the Neolithic, let's subject it to analysis. So moving past that, we have a couple of interesting hits that did come from Mycenaean Greece. The same Pat McGovern that I mentioned discovered something in Grave Circle A, which most classicists know about, from the Mycenaean period. This is like 1600 BC, more or less, on the Peloponnese, southwest of Athens and mainland Greece there. He did find something that he calls a Minoan ritual cocktail. It's one of my favorite phrases. And so he subjected this pottery beer mug, he describes it, to analysis, and wound up finding calcium oxalate, tartaric acid, and potassium gluconate. And in layman's terms, beer, wine, and mead, exactly like you said. So these aren't just ideas about what people were drinking. This is 20 years ago. We know definitively that there was some kind of mixed drink out there, and it just brings a lot of credibility, in my mind, to the hunt for intoxicants. And so with a hit like that, I thought, okay, so, there are drinks out there. We are finding it. Someone must have found something to substantiate this idea of a psychoactive koukion, because even Pat McGovern himself says that from all the testimony we have, clearly there's something more going on than a high alcoholic content. And I made the point earlier on Rogan's podcast, and I'll make it again here, which I think is important, that the Greeks didn't have a word for alcohol. In fact, that word alcohol, unlike the other 60% of the English language that comes from Greek and Latin, it didn't exist for the ancient Greeks. I'm sure they had a concept of it, but there was no word alcohol. There's a reason we take it from the Arabic and not from Greek. The way they looked at beer and wine or other things were these mixed potions. And occasionally you would mix toxins and plants and herbs into your beer and wine. And so we haven't found that psychedelic smoking gun inside Greece yet, and we all want to find it. So what I did is took a giant step back at the entire ancient world and figured out where the Greek influence could have been to find one of these samples. And so I looked from ancient Iberia, Spain, Portugal in the far west, to Afghanistan in the far east, because after Alexander the Great, the Greeks are all the way into the Himalayas, into the Hindu Kush, down into India. So they were all over the ancient world. And as I started Googling the word ergot in different languages to see, hey, was Wasson, Hoffman, and Ruck totally bonkers? Or did this stuff exist somewhere? I started reading things in the scientific literature about ergot, which is cornezuelo de centeno in Spanish. And it took me to this little archaeological site that very few people have heard of called Mas Castellar de Pontos. And there, beginning in 1990, this wonderful archaeologist, Enriqueta Pons, turned up one Greek artifact after another at a place that I can speak for myself, at least, I'd never heard of. I'd never even thought about the Greeks in Spain. Why would you when you can spend a lifetime reading the literature that came out of Athens? And I totally get it, but there is this presence there. And there's this religious ambiance there that was immediate from her finds, including this sanctuary where, I'll cut to the chase now, she, in addition to lots of different things like a marble pedestal, which she calls an altar, that we know came from Greece, and in addition to Dionysian vases from the 5th century BC and terracotta heads of Persephone from the 3rd century BC, she found a miniature chalice, which is about that big, so not a pint glass, more of a shot glass, in the shape of the cup that is ritually drunk by the god Dionysus himself. It's called a kantharos. And again, in my mind, it's just not supposed to be there. When I think of the ancient Greeks, I don't think of a farm in Spain, in Catalonia, northeast Spain. And after this was excavated in the mid-90s, Enriqueta enlists a colleague of hers, Jordi Treserras, and he, through optical microscopy and scanning electron microscope, he finds the remains not only of beer, but ergot. And nobody ever hears about it because it's published in Catalan in a 635-page monograph that I had to go to the Library of Congress to read for myself. And once or twice in Spanish, Jordi mentioned it in the succeeding years. He was a wonderful archaeobotanist. He was prolific. I don't doubt his results. I think it's absolutely incredible what he found. It's just a classic case of something that extraordinary being underreported.
Wow. That's phenomenal.
It's where your classics background, really comes in handy, because you have to know a lot of languages and you have to be able to be facile in them all.
Well, it's a missing puzzle piece that you weren't able to find in Eleusis because they had basically contaminated the vessels by their display techniques and things, and so you had to look further, like where could the authentic brew be found outside of Greece, which is sort of a lot like the ayahuasca diffusion outside of the jungles now, which can be found in all corners of our globe, really. That this kind of thing, although it wasn't supposed to happen, inevitably happened because of the power and the importance of the experience, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, Alex. It's just, it's when I started, there are some, I found one or two classicists who do talk about this site, Pontos, because there was a very important Greek colony called Emporion, founded in the 6th century BC, which, again, just transparently, I hadn't heard of, but fortunately others had, and were writing about it. And they do refer to a place like Pontos as an open access sanctuary. I love that phrase. I think that's Denise Demetriou in California. She refers to it as an open access sanctuary, where there's more than just Greek things happening there, by the way, and the archaeologists would be the first to say that, Enriqueta. There was this syncretic mix of Greek elements and Celtic elements and indigenous Iberian elements. The tribe there is the Indigetes. It's this wonderful syncretic mix, but the thing that bound them all together were these grain goddesses, Demeter and Persephone, because they're these chthonic goddesses, these primordial goddesses. And there's another scholar I reference in the book saying, if there was one pair of deities to unite people as diverse as the Greeks and the Celts and the indigenous Iberians, wouldn't it be these underworld deities? Or wouldn't it be the grain goddess, right? If beer is 13,000 years old, if beer or bread, grain is the thing that took us from the caves to the cities, we would still be worshiping. We would still have this reverence for the grain. And that's what Demeter was. She was a conscious throwback to prehistory. And it makes total sense that there would still be an influence thousands and thousands of years later, because the Greeks, remember, who are these vintners, they're famous for their wine and they're famous for their literature. In the Mysteries of Eleusis, they're not drinking wine and they're not writing down the secret. It's an oral secret tradition based on some kind of, I call it a beer sacrament, that could stretch back thousands and thousands of years. It's a conscious throwback to prehistory. And so for me, it makes perfect sense that one of these open access sanctuaries would pop up in Spain for those who couldn't afford the trip to Eleusis. And in the book, I say it's not crazy to consider Pontos as a backdoor into Eleusis, but at the same time, I don't know what to make of it. And it's going to be a wonderful debate with people who are smarter than me about how this relates to Eleusis, what was happening in Eleusis. We don't know that an ergotized beer was drunk at Eleusis for 2,000 years, from 1500 BC to the 4th century AD. But this is great scientific data. This is the stuff you want to argue about and, have colloquia about and go to Harvard and talk to Greg Nage about, the classicist who was looking over my shoulder once or twice and telling me to be careful with my language and to be a very good scholar and not to blow this out of proportion. And so in all deference to Greg Nage, who is the director of the Center for Hellenic Studies here in Washington, D.C., who was just so kind to me, I just want to be very careful about my language. I do not know what this means, but I do think it is one of the most fascinating elements of discovery that has happened in my adult life as someone who loves Latin and Greek, and something as nerdy as that could possibly, invite a wider audience into the thing that really saved my life, which is the classics. And I mean that seriously. It saved my life.
Well, I think that they're so widely regarded as the foundation of Western civilization because they carry the ideals, truth, goodness, beauty, these great ideals that are first kind of pointed to in the Greek tradition. I have always felt like Plato, Socrates, and the Neoplatonic tradition has been very much of a psychedelic kind of religion because it posits that there is a sacred visionary dimension that is a parallel dimension that under the right conditions can be met. And the race of the gods and unities of all things can be seen even behind closed eyes was one quote that I remember. So they get close to talking about the kinds of things that anyone who's taken psychedelics would say, well, they're clearly tripping in some way, but because it was, they were admonished to keep it secret. That, it's thanks to you that this tremendous secret, I think we're, to my mind, at a Greek outpost in Iberia to show the presence of these things is as close to a smoking gun that one needs, I think, to begin trying to unravel it.
That's all. We're just trying to unravel it. That's it.
I just wondered what your take would be. I mean, I read the 100 lines of Sappho, and it seemed to me that they were all about love, sex, and the altered state of the Kaikion. And so she doesn't say that, but the descriptions are very rich in that. And I wondered if you had any take on that. And also, while you're at it, the Demeter and Persephone cults were goddess worship. And they were rather, large and, made big festivals happen. And I just wondered whether, what would your take be on the idea that the first brewers could so very well have been women? Because they were creating the grain into the brew, and they eventually, discovered bread and things like that. But I mean, this was the first brewers, and they were women they were worshiping the goddess. I thought that
do
it was.
We know? I think that's a great question.
Yeah. Do we know? What do we know about that?
Priestesses. Who was making the
who was brewing
beer?
Women. As far as we can tell, it's women. I didn't set out to write a feminist piece of scholarship, but the data, again, would keep bundling and bundling. Every time you look at it, Carl Ruck certainly thought that. He writes a lot about the priestesses in the 1978, The Road to Eleusis. But even when I was talking to these beer scientists, people who study brewing, it wasn't just at Eleusis where they think that women carried the tradition. And Ruck has this romantic phrase, the secret of secrets, capital S, the secret of secrets. It was the women's domain. And in talking with Pat McGovern at UPenn and Martin Zarnkow in Germany, again, this idea of women being the original brewers kept coming up. In Egypt and Sumeria, we think potentially as far back as a place like Göbekli Tepe or earlier, where in traditional societies, it was women who were gathering the additives and brewing the beer. This is something that continues until the industrialization of the brewing process. In the Reformation, 16th century. You mentioned earlier about the holy men always brew. We know that monks like to brew beer. That's for lots of different reasons. Water is easily contaminated. You don't want to be drinking bad water in the midst of an outbreak. So another reason, by the way, that beer may have preceded bread 12,000 years ago. It's relatively sterile. And the same thing was happening in the 16th century. Only then did it become the men's trade. Outside the monks and religious communities, again, women were running the ale houses, women were brewing the beer. It's only then with industrialization that it becomes the men's trade, which maybe it still is today. Hopefully that's changing. I don't know, but it's a really fascinating piece of this. And same for the wine mixing. It's the same thing, even though the gods were male, and I talk about Osiris in Egypt and El in the Near East, and I talk about Dionysus and Jesus as a wine god, male wine gods. It was women who were mixing this wine. It seems to be, at least in ancient Greece, the Maenads and so forth.
Well, the Maenads, that's a fascinating thing. They wound up maybe the caretakers for Dionysus or something as a baby, and wound up eating the body as they moved along and dismembering. So this whole idea of taking in the body and the blood and things like that as a ritual, isn't that where that's born?
Yeah, it's really, again, just thinking about the classics, it's not really controversial, at least when you read gold standard classicists like Walter Burkert, this brilliant German scholar, writes in the 1970s that to them, the sacramental drinking of the blood and of Dionysus, the sacramental drinking of his blood was seen as a religious act of communion. I have several quotes in the book to that effect. It wasn't so controversial. The controversy arises when you're comparing what was happening in ancient Greece to early Christianity, and this thing that I call the pagan continuity hypothesis. How much borrowing did we have from one to the other? And I mentioned like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, was writing about this in the mid-20th century, about the influence of the mystery religions on Christianity. It goes back to the late 19th century and the Golden Bough and things like this. And this used to be part of the academic discussion. And I don't know what happened to it. I think it's a fascinating piece of history and kind of commonsensical that Christianity wasn't born in a vacuum. And that must have come into contact with what Dr. King referred to as the general trend of the time. He thought it was an unconscious process, for example. And you have scholars all along the spectrum trying to figure out what the real relationship was. And of course, we don't know. But, I was looking at the earliest Christian communities who were Greek speakers and asking the obvious question, is it possible that they had, smuggled some of their Greek ancestry and that general trend of spiking wine into their version of the Eucharist and the early Mass, because there wasn't much central authority in the very early days in a place like Corinth or Ephesus or southern Italy. Maybe you were a fan of both wine gods, Dionysus and Jesus. And maybe your spiked Greek wine that used to send the Maenads into ecstasy made sense when you were welcoming this new wine god from Galilee into your religious life? So, I mean, lots of big questions, but again, I take the time to really look at really hard at the linguistic and the iconographic and the scientific evidence to see if there's any truth there.
Yeah, and looking over the Gnostic library, did you find references that were helpful?
I did look at the Gnostics. I'm a huge fan of Elaine Pagels, who I've had the honor to correspond with. I think she's absolutely brilliant. For those who don't know, she's a scholar of early Christianity at Princeton. I love her translation of Thomas's Gospel. I think if I had my druthers, I'd incorporate, and I think she says this too, I would love to see the Gospel of Thomas inside the canonical New Testament. It's interesting. You know, you like anything with philology and word games and looking at the literature, I think there's only so much you can tease out from someone like Thomas. There are interesting clues, and I mentioned several of them. There's a great line: "The kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth, but men do not see it." And this idea is that if you could just change your vision, there's another great line: "What is hidden will be revealed to you." This is all in the Gospel of Thomas. It speaks very much to your interest in Neoplatonism, Alex. There's a Plotinus in the 3rd century saying something very similar about we all have this faculty, he calls it, that everyone possesses, but few people ever use. This inner vision. Imagine that we all have it, but so few of us ever use. This ability to unlock this vision. The Gospel of Thomas is talking about something very similar. But you don't have to just look at the Gnostics, from the Greek meaning to know intuitively, right? Not to read about something, but to know. I found the way I read the Gospel of John, there's lots of great clues there too, inside the Gospels. Jesus in John's Gospel talks about coming to teach the blind how to see. Or he says that I promise you will see the heavens open and God's angels going up and down. I mean, this is in the New Testament that you can find in any hotel. They're really inspiring, kind of provocative lines that you can tease out from any Gospels. So I think it's all ripe for investigation.
I wanted to go back to your biblical references having to do with the burning bush. I also wanted you to maybe comment on sort of speculations around manna being related to mushrooms, growing up on the dung of all the livestock, that with myriad, hundreds of thousands of heads of livestock that are reported in the book of Numbers. So I just wondered whether, and really, I mean, Moses was a shepherd, so he was out there with a lot of flock. I mean, you were saying that you thought that the acacia bush or something was more the culprit of his revelation, whereas I've always thought of it as the mushrooms growing on the dung of all the livestock. So I just wondered what your take was on that, or your research.
Like, I'll speculate on anything.
Okay, me too.
I've read all that. I've read Dan Merker's wonderful material and Benny Shannon and Rick Strassman, and there's all kinds of great ideas for what it is. The thing that knocked me over was what happened in May earlier this year, when the Israeli researchers unveiled what they say is some of the first evidence for psychoactive ritualistic drug use well, at least in the Judahite tradition in the Holy Land. They found this incredible sample of organic remains that tested positive for cannabis on this limestone altar at Tel Arad, south of Jerusalem, dated to the 8th century BC in the Judahite region and period. And it tested positive for THC, CBD, and CBN. And the researchers that themselves say that it was some kind of incense that was ritually burned, seemingly for its psychoactive properties. And so you have a hit like that, and again, it opens up the field of speculation and makes this less of a silly conversation. I think that there's so much evidence that hasn't been looked at. The archaeochemistry is just beginning to do this. At Tel Arad, for example, that the organic remains of that incense cannabis and frankincense, they determined, was excavated in the 1960s. I mean, imagine that. It was just sitting in a museum in Israel waiting for someone to come along and just test it. It's not like we're going out into the field and finding this stuff. Some of it is just locked away, waiting for an archaeochemist like Andrew Coe at MIT to come along and blast this stuff with gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, and all these wonderful instruments that can tell us once and for all, how did our ancestors get in touch with God and what did it mean to them? And it's not to say that in every case there was some kind of psychoactive ritual, but if it is an important part of our history, it's a part that ought to be told, and it's a part that mainstream academics and policymakers, like here in Washington, D.C., and religious institutions ought to be talking about, I think, in a very responsible way. The data is there.
Well, and now the revelations that a way to commune with the sacred through the use of a sacrament is more or less becoming a mainstream knowledge. And the psychedelic therapies have been so helpful for people who are traumatized, but it's also for the betterment of well people. And so these earlier rituals of multiple cultures point to the intrinsic value that these things had. They may have been the first cause for people to create temples, as in Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, that's why when I picked up the God pill in The Economist in 2007, that's why I can't put it down, because you have this experience, and to the extent our neurochemistry hasn't changed over the past 20 or 200 or 2,000 or 20,000 years, what was happening then could be what's happening now. The experiences that these volunteers at Hopkins and NYU keep talking about could be the kind of thing that was involved in early religious ritual, not just in early Christianity or among the ancient Greeks, but among our prehistoric ancestors. And this is what Wasson was fascinated by, the possibility that this could unlock the very origins of religion itself, which is why you have to think in terms of tens of thousands of years or longer, or across our species. It's just an incredible field of study that we're only beginning. And even in this conversation, I mean, I could talk for 3 hours. We are scratching the surface, but there are serious academics and scientists like Lee Berger in South Africa, like Andrew Coe, who has this amazing organization, Open Archem. I want to plug for him simply because it's this online repository of the very best scientists looking at this from a transdisciplinary perspective. They look at the literature, the ethnobotanical evidence, they look at the science, and they combine everything they can using the best of the sciences and the humanities to make one coherent picture of where we come from. And this is what academia is for. I think that the whole point is to unlock some of these secrets from the past, and we're really just beginning.
Well, I think that it's taken an incredibly independent researcher like yourself to draw these diverse fields of inquiry together to, as it were, thread the needle with the important scientific data that would make it more than a hypothesis, but make it a more credible potentiality that these have obviously played an important role in the development of, I'd say, all world religions practically. You know, that if we look into their mystical foundations, certainly have to find the mystical experience, which is what people were, I think, coming from around the world to experience.
I think it's all very possible. This is part of the hypothesis, or maybe we're moving into a theory. Maybe these are things that can be tested and falsified. That's what really interests me is testing and falsifying it. But again, if you look at our species, religion is fairly universal. Something else that's universal is language, and something else is pharmacology. It's hard to find a group of humans anywhere who don't know how to interact with their surroundings. And again, that goes back a very, very long time. We're talking about 391,000 species of plants, 80,000 of which are edible. We're talking perhaps 1.5 million species of fungi, 20,000 of which produce mushrooms. These things come on the planet hundreds of millions of years ago. The idea that at some point we didn't co-evolve with the plants and the fungi is ridiculous to me. I think that they wouldn't have the effect they did on us. They wouldn't, lock and key into our neurochemistry to produce these effects unless it was something natural. We have to use that word, natural. And I don't point to psychedelics as the thing, or it's actually not the key in the Immortality Key. That's not what I mean by the Immortality Key. I think that psychedelics represent a very fundamental part of that toolkit. But when it comes to the archaic techniques of ecstasy, there are lots of ways to connect with each other and with the earth and with the cosmos at large. And this is very Greek stuff. This seems to be the root of Christianity itself. When, if you're on your deathbed and you have a couple seconds left to describe what Christianity means, and I consider myself a Christian, you got to say love and nothing else but love. It's what Jesus himself said when he was asked to summarize his mission. And so anything that can help well that up is something that interests me, which is why when I talk to Dinah Baser, one of the NYU volunteers, she talks about being bathed in God's love, bathed in God's love. An atheist described her experience with psilocybin as being bathed in God's love.
Doesn't Christ mean the anointed?
Yeah, Christos. Yeah, it means to anoint. Yeah.
Exactly. Anointed with what? And now we know that the Jewish priests were using cannabis. Cannabis oil and things like this were part of the anointing, I would imagine,
It's all very possible, Alex. And we have the balm of Gilead and the temple oil. There's plenty of material to look at in the Old and New Testament for the use of healing plants and herbs. Like the rest of our ancestors, the biblical people were not unfamiliar with their environment. So it's all ripe for investigation.
I think that this providing the truth about religion will help us get a new perspective on many of our activities, and perhaps can help us to get back to the ideals that I even think that the founders of our nation, although as troubling as many of them were, there was a sense of idealism and equality and democracy that had been established in Greek civilization early on. So it'll help us to see with new clarity, Brian, I think.
I hope so. I think that we're living at this incredible time where we can shine a light on the past. The ancient Greeks weren't perfect. The founding fathers weren't perfect people, but their ideals were there. Equality and justice and goodwill towards our fellow men and women. I think that's an important part. And when it's not there, we've seen the depths to which civil discourse can take us in this country. I do think our democracy has been poisoned. And I don't say that as a Democrat or a Republican. I say that as someone who lives in Washington, D.C., just looking at something that's changed in the way we talk about this gift of democracy that we inherited from our ancestors. If Eleusis really was central to ancient Greek life, what does it say about life today? What if we could incorporate something like that? The psychedelic sacrament, or whatever it was aside, Eleusis was very important to the ancient Greeks. It was described in the 4th century AD, before it was almost destroyed by this guy Praetextatus, who I love to talk about, this Roman guy who said that Eleusis was the thing that held the entire human race together, and that in its absence, life would be unlivable. He says abiotos in Greek. Centuries before him, Cicero, another Roman, says that Eleusis is the most exceptional and divine thing that Athens ever produced, right? So it wasn't democracy, it wasn't the arts and sciences, it wasn't all these great things that we take as part and parcel of Western civilization. It was Eleusis that was the most exceptional thing. And Eleusis was this incredible rite of passage where people lost their fear of death. Okay, so the psychedelic question aside, that's what Eleusis was. The testimony is universal about that. They went there to become immortal. And we have this prophecy of sorts from the 4th century AD that if the mysteries died, we would die. What does that say about the health of our democracy? That we've lost these rites of passage that were natural to the ancient Greeks. And how can we resurrect that in a responsible way today? These are the things that keep me up at night.
There's so many questions.
It's been extraordinary. And I think that, listeners should check out the Immortality Key, and audiobooks I've heard is going really well. Did you read that, Brian? Did you read the...
I've learned a couple things over the past week. I read it myself, and apparently, I never knew this over the past 40 years. My voice sounds like Edward Norton, according to comments on YouTube. So for some reason, people, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but people are really liking the Audible. And Joe has been so kind to promote that. You guys are so kind to talk about this. This is why I don't do drugs. This is, to me, this is a totally psychedelic experience. There is I'm just swimming in love, and I'm so happy.
It's a good thing though. And those of us who have enjoyed it and benefited from it encourage you.
Well, at the right moment, at the right time, I feel like,
Exactly.
when you feel ready, I feel so grateful that you've been, like one of my other psychedelic heroes, Walter Pankey.
Oh, yeah.
He also ran the Good Friday experiment back in 1962, the first and only psilocybin experiment to prove this same kind of proportions that you were talking about, people who would have the mystical experience. And so he also decided to remain a psychedelic virgin until he had completed his research on this. And so it was Bill Richards that got to spend the first psychedelic journey with Walter. And so he was in the best of hands and had an amazing journey.
Wow, that's incredible. I didn't know that. I didn't know. That.
Oh, really? Yeah. You know Walter, though, right?
Of course, the miracle at Marsh Chapel, of course. But yeah, I never knew that thing. That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah, and was of the same mind as you, that to keep his research perspective pure from a scientist perspective who may also have not been initiated in some way, to not, quote, contaminate the results by having used the substances oneself. So congratulations for your self-control. And
I'm in good company.
We gave it a long break when we became parents. I'll just tell you. Long break. It's good to go without.
Yes, but one experience can last a lifetime, as many people you may have.
Well, from talking to Dinah Baser, that's certainly the case. It's been many years now, and she can dredge up memories about that single session with psilocybin like it was yesterday. It's so inspiring to talk to her about it, and I know she's not alone. Which is, again, I can't put this stuff down. There's something there. There's a mystery there. It's mysteries on top of mysteries that speak to the entire history of our species and perhaps beyond.
Absolutely.
And I think it's just fascinating.
I want to mention one thing, because it is really the same reasoning as why we are here at the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors. We had our psychedelic mystical experiences at really the foundation of our relationship 45 and 44 years ago.
And then the foundation of our mission, which is to build an enduring sanctuary of visionary art to uplift a global community. And that came with our first MDMA experience. So we made that intention in 1985, and here we are. And we're about to open Entheon, which is the sanctuary of visionary art at CoSM. I mean, we had to create a whole community. We knew we had to uplift a global community. You have to have a community. So anyway, now we're about to open, and you were about to say.
Well, just that there are psychedelic relics.
That's right.
We have a little pottery shard from Eleusis that our friend found on the side of the Telestrion. But there are numerous things, gifts from the Hoffman family, his spectacles that he wore when he was creating the LSD, and we have sort of bone from ashes of Timothy Leary and a number of
We have a stone, a mushroom from Paul Stamets' collection.
So the Guatemalan mushroom stones, and so we're gathering some of the
relics.
So it's a. I think Hoffman spoke of new Eleusis and the importance of finding a way to that. I've often felt that festival culture and Burning Man and things like that point to this, trying to rediscover this truth. And so we're trying to put a little bit of that psychedelic history into Entheon. So we're super grateful, and I'm sure we're going to be selling the Immortality Key in the Entheon bookstore
when we open.
for sure.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. I can't wait to visit it. I want to see it for myself.
It's so close. When everything is all settled and things are safe again, we will open and you will visit, and we'll just consider you such an honored guest.
A special guest, perhaps you
Bring
can...
the family.
Yeah.
My daughters would love it. They love road trips.
That's so great. Well, it's been wonderful talking to you today. Thank you for being with us on our podcast.
And to you, really, I mean, I'm very, very honored to speak with both of you. I mean that sincerely. It's your art is part of my psyche, and it's been a huge part of my journey since I was a teenager. I think, Alex. It's just it's wonderful to see your background there, and for me, this is it's very meaningful. I'm such a huge fan.
Oh,
Thank you so much, Brian. All right. I hope to be in contact soon.
Anytime you need me, I'm here.
good
All right,
luck,
thank
Brian.
you.